On today's FBS podcast, we are going to do something a little different. This episode is another in our climate adaptation series. Instead of listening to our usual host's banter about today's topic, we are going to share the audio of a presentation made by the Forest Business School's own Steve Bick at last year's New England Society of American Foresters annual meeting. The presentation is called Critical Chains in Forestry, and it spans a couple of topics that are important to people in the forestry world. First, he is going to talk about some work he is doing on climate adaptation in Vermont's forest product supply chain as part of a Forest Service landscape scale restoration grant he has partnered on with the Forest Economy Program at the Vermont Department of Forests, Parks, and Recreation. One of the things he will share is a recent needs assessment he conducted with a survey of people who work in this forest products supply chain. This assessment revealed is that project management is the most common area in which people plan to make improvements. With this in mind, Bick goes on to talk about critical chain project management and how it can be used to complete work sooner and mitigate against time loss to the unpredictability of seasonal weather patterns. Let's hear what he has to say.
Steve is a graduate of SUNY ESF and has a PhD in forest management and economics from Virginia Tech. He is currently working on an LSR project with Vermont FPR on climate adaptation in the forest products supply chain, and also works on the financial well-being of working lands and small businesses. These two interests merge in his presentation on critical chains in forestry. Please help me in welcoming Steve Bick.
Thanks, Woody. So back, I guess it was November, when Woody reached out to me, he said, I'm hosting a session at SAF, and would you come and talk about anything you want? And that's what I always hear, but he said it out loud. He didn't tell me I'd have to follow the best speaker I've seen all day, or I'd be the last person before happy hour, but I can work with that. So what I gave him back was this Critical Chains in Forestry title, which will take me probably 40 minutes to explain. Pull this over? All right. So why don't I start with a little overview. Really, I want to talk about two or really three things. So what are critical chains? I'm going to talk about the forest product supply chain and a little bit about why it's critical. And I'm going to talk about critical chain project management and pull them both together under this idea of adaptation to climate change in the supply chain. So I'll tell you a little bit about a vulnerability study I did on the forest product supply chain in the Northeast, and more about this LSR I'm working on with Catherine Servideo and others in Vermont. And then finally, well, not finally, but I've got a needs assessment survey out in connection with that. I've got some preliminary results to share, and this all leads up to something I want to say about project management. So I'll come to all that. So the backstory on this is about 5 years ago, the Forest Service reached out to me to do this vulnerability assessment around the Northeast. They called me one afternoon, and they really only had three conditions. They needed a proposal that day. They wanted me to focus in Vermont. They wanted me to work with Paul Frederick. So that was all doable, believe it or not, and 18 short months later, we started the project. So I want to define the supply chain first, because it seems to get defined in some interesting ways, particularly in Vermont, but I'm talking about the primary forest product supply chain. So the forest land, the landowners, the foresters who manage it, the loggers who harvest the timber, and then the primary mills that buy logs and other roundwood products and chips and so on. So I kind of think I don't need to make the case that the supply chain is critical to this group. Just to say a couple things about it, though. You know, the forest product supply chain sort of enables us to manage our forests. It allows forest landowners to own their land. It allows people to make a living on the working landscape. It allows the mills to get the materials they need to produce wood products that our society demands. So where does this critical chain project management aspect come in? Woody mentioned I run the Vermont Forest Business School, and the beauty of this program, this is a 6 months program for mid-career professionals, most of them small business owners, but I get to take proven concepts, from the business world and sort of workshop them with people that know a lot, that are out there working every day. So this program is centered in Vermont, but I run a regional session as well, and as of next week, I'll have put 75 people through it, including people in 12 states and one Canadian province. And so I spent some time this year with 4 different groups talking about critical chain project management and how we apply it to forestry. So I have some insights there to share, and I'll tie this all together. So to go back to that vulnerability assessment, the first thing I did was to try and define what's changed. And conveniently, I took the time period from the 1980s when I entered this industry through the 2010s, which was the kind of, we wrapped up in 2019. I don't think it was helpful when I would talk with people in the forest product supply chain to say, hey, did you know it's on average 2 degrees warmer than it was in 1900? Because that doesn't tell us very much. So I wanted to know, what are the differences in seasonal temperatures and in monthly precipitation? And if I had to define the climate change impact on the forest product supply chain in one sentence, I would say that we have changes in our seasonal soil moisture patterns, and probably not for the better. We've got some different mud seasons, more frequent storm events, and pest diseases, invasive species, other challenges, policies as well. Those were part of the vulnerability assessment, but that's about the last thing I'm going to say about them today. In terms of the monthly comparisons, and I looked at every county in the Northeast, and this again part of that vulnerability assessment, some patterns jumped out at me, all right? So between the 1980s and the 2010s through 2019, January on average in the northern forest states is 3.6 degrees warmer. September's warmer as well, but you know, that sort of corresponds with what I think of as that best season of the year for timber harvesting. And then December, 4.6 degrees warmer, but then look at that in combination with the changes in precipitation. So 1.3 inches more precipitation in December, even as it's that much warmer. So we're getting it as rain rather than winter, and I'm hard pressed to think of December as a winter month anymore, especially not the last couple of years here. We get an inch more rain in June. And so, you know, things starting to dry out now, or hopefully will dry out, and you might get a little bit of a timber harvesting season, a season when you can supply mills, when landowners can get some work done. But then we get that inch in June, and somebody was just telling me about a piece of equipment idled, Woody, right, for how many months? Yeah, so we get this start-stop pattern, which is much more common in southern New England, southern New York, Pennsylvania, and so on. So one person told me the logging chance is changing, and it has changed. And I think a lot of you have come into this at a time when you hear older people like me talk about the way winter used to be, and it's just not there anymore. To put a little finer point on the lesser winters, I mapped the counties that had average January temperatures of 20 degrees or less. So in the 80s, that's the map on the further map. We had 32 more counties that had that temperature than we do now. And I picked that 20 degrees as kind of arbitrarily, but to me, and I've done a lot of winter logging in the western Adirondacks, or at least had a lot of loggers working there. You know, you need that at a minimum to freeze things in place and get access to remote places. So things have clearly changed. In terms of adaptations, I thought Steve's presentation really brought those out very well, the things that we're doing differently and doing more of in terms of the logging part of it. But there's also corresponding changes in forest management activities, harvest scheduling, the logging practices, of course. How do you fill a mill when you have fewer days of the year to work in? So I'll talk a little bit about each of these things. In terms of managing forests, when I talk to people, it's clear that harvest scheduling became more difficult, right? There's less of the year to work with, or if you've got a marginal or a hard to get to site, or a marginal harvest, like the one Graham mentioned, right? Where the BMPs cost more than the timber is worth, then it's hard to get anyone to go there. As one person told me, we've gotten better at picking where we go and when, and I think one of the bigger land management companies told me they've really started to integrate that into their inventory work. They categorize the accessibility, the months of the year when they can work there, even as they're inventorying the timber. In terms of infrastructure, we've seen improvements to gravel roads. We've seen more gravel roads, which again, it's a benefit. It's an infrastructure improvement, but it's a cost. Greater use of stone. Biggest logger in the Adirondacks left the industry 2 years ago to focus on his stone business because he said, at least that's something I can make money at. Yeah. And we're seeing upgraded winter road systems. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. Somebody said we're using bigger culverts because we get more flash events. I think the easiest thing in the past maybe to skimp on was culvert size. Maybe they were adequate for our expectations 30 years ago, and they're not big enough anymore, right? And we see it when they fail, so we need to go bigger. What also was clear is we're starting to lose that culture of winter logging. I always like to show this picture of my friend Bruce Koenig. I've been fortunate enough to know him for 51 years, and I have not worked with him all that time. I haven't been in the industry quite that long yet, but here's a guy that grew up in remote places and is just a wizard at freezing a winter road in place. He's 80 now, he was 78 in that photo, I think, and was still working with his nephew, putting a road in. We're losing people with the ability to do that. And that led into, what I heard from some of the bigger land managers. I don't know if you told me this, Tom, but some of the other ones did as well, that we're making these semi-permanent winter roads. So these are roads with everything but gravel. The drainage is all in place, because with that narrower window to work with, they could freeze it quickly. And they could freeze it with somebody with maybe a little bit less skill at this. So I want to talk about logging next, and then procurement. And I don't have to say much about logging because we really saw it all with Steve's presentation, but in that time period, we saw water quality AMPs and BMPs. No one had heard of those things when I entered the industry, not in the Northeast. And we saw by 2000, I think we had widespread compliance efforts, recognition. Vermont certainly was a leader in this and was maybe ahead of that schedule. This used to be a cleanup item, but now these are the minimum things you need to do to work. And not just from a regulatory standpoint, from the standpoint of being able to get your equipment out on the property and get the timber out. So here's a handsome Longview corduroy trail down in southern Vermont somewhere. Somebody told me this, and I think I can share who. He says, when you look at the BMP manual, there are structural BMPs, but there are a lot of behavioral BMPs, and the opportunity cost associated with those go uncompensated. And actually, that was Tom Pavlesich at the Watershed Ag Council. Somebody mentioned that during the last session. They do pay for BMPs. I've always thought it funny when they said, we've got to figure out BMP costs, and they focus on what does a bridge cost, or what does it cost to put a water bar in. All direct costs, all important things. The major cost is lost time. It's time when, if you follow the BMPs, you're not working, and I've got more to say on that. We've seen shifts in equipment, and again, all these shifts are sort of climate influenced, but there's other forces at work here, and it's hard to separate the two. But in terms of equipment, logger in Western Maine told me that skidder was the best business move I've ever made, less fuel, less men. So here's a guy that is still in logging and still successful because he keeps track of his numbers. In the 1990s, when fuel costs really wasn't something that people talked about every single day, he was moving 0.43 tons per gallon. When he switched to these six-wheeled Tiger Cats, which great machine, not suitable everywhere, but when he switched to that, 1.1 tons per gallon, and that made a big difference. Cut to length has come into our region over the last 30 years. And it's got an important role, and I think climate adaptation, the thought that you may gain some days, is some of the motivation. I'm not convinced this system is the cure-all that some people think it is, but it's certainly part of the solution, right? And every once in a while, I still meet someone who thinks you can't make a rut with one of these things. We get. There's a whole lot of skidder under there, okay? So it looks like winter, but it's not. And I don't need to convince anybody of that this year or even the year before. That's a $375,000 machine at that time, and we're only looking at about a third of it. Yeah, so quite a thing to invest in if you got to do that. Somebody told me I'd rather buy 10 loads of stone than be out of work for a week, and stone is a great way to gain time, but it costs money, right? It's more expensive to harvest timber. Just talk for a minute or two about procurement here. As somebody up in the kingdom here told me, if you don't get the logs, it doesn't matter how many orders you have. Okay, so if you can tell what species that is, you know it grows on mostly wet ground, so there's a whole lot of year you're not going to procure it. And if your sawmill runs exclusively on that, like one up near Albany does, right, you've got a pretty short window to get your year's supply of wood. Talking with people at mills, it was clear that sawmills are providing some AMP and BMP assistance, loaning out bridges, loaning out those steel culverts, occasionally assistance with permitting and that sort of thing. Talked to a guy at a big paper mill, and he said, you need a nimble suite of supply options to draw on as needed. And so that could be varying types of supply contracts, extended supply areas, remote shipyards, concentration yards, backhaul, leveraging, things, and right down to even financing loggers, which one mill was doing. So people are doing whatever they need to supply the mill. So, okay, enough of the background, and I think most of you have lived this, so those were maybe just some reminders. Let me talk about this LSR that I've been working on. It's a 3-year project, so I'm fortunate here in Vermont that Commissioner Danny will let me pitch an LSR and then sort of figure out where it fits. So she put this project together with one that Ali Kasiba is doing, and I think she presented earlier today. And so we have kind of separate complementary projects under one window. So I'm doing this climate adaptation needs assessment in Vermont's forest product supply chain. And that's what I'm working on now with Catherine Servideo and some others. So I'm in the needs assessment. The next 2 years I'm going to focus on compiling resources to provide some assistance to people and then doing outreach and service provider training. Any Philip Goodwin fans here? Did anybody get this postcard in the mail from me not too long ago? A few of you. Did you save it? Did you fill out the survey? So my hope was that you wouldn't want to throw it away right away because it's kind of a nice print. And so this survey went out, and I sent 682 of these postcards with a link in. Gotten 92 responses, so I'll take it, but I could use a few more. If you work in Vermont in the forest product supply chain, that quick read code or that link will get you there. But I do have some results that I can share. Among other things, I asked people, what seasons of the year challenge your ability to sell, harvest, or procure timber and forest products? So, it's worded that way because it went out to forest landowners, to foresters, to loggers, to truckers, and to all sorts of mills. The interesting thing to me is for all 4 seasons, over 60% of the respondents said it's a challenge. Traditionally we might think of as spring as a challenge and fall as a challenge, and somebody would clearly identify all of them, but over 60% in each case, and that's indicative of the kind of weather we've had the last 2 or 3 years in particular. That survey has ample write-in places because I get lots of great quotes and ideas, and someone said there's no longer a winter season, nor is there a dry season. Right? Winter really looks like, in Vermont now, looks more like it has in southern New England for quite a while, I think. And there's plenty of wet conditions. I asked people, how many weeks in the past year was it really hard to sell, harvest, or procure wood products? I asked this for both climate and market-related reasons. Okay, so the climate, weather-related reasons, 19 weeks of the year was the average, 13 for market, and let's hope they overlap somewhat. I'm sure they do. But if you can't sell your timber or get someone to harvest it or do the logging or procure wood in 19 weeks of the year, that leaves you 33 weeks, right? That's 165 days. If you're a logger, that's barely break even. I have calculated logging costs since 1998 with loggers from Pennsylvania to Maine, and really, we used to think 180, probably 200 days, and good business practices is a sustainable level to not just make a living, make a profit, and want to keep working at this. So this is a challenge, and if there's a weak link in the supply chain, the tipping point's going to come with the logging first. So I'll go back to this quote from Tom at the Watershed Ag Council. When you look at the BMP manual, there's structural BMPs and so on, but the opportunity costs go uncompensated. And the opportunity costs are those 19 weeks of the year with no revenue or little revenue and still a host of expenses. I asked people, what exactly are these impacts? And I got some great quotes. I can almost guess who this was, but I cannot generate enough revenue to cover my overhead, and it's also affected my ability to keep employees. It costs more when we work in these conditions because of the added expense of maintaining trails, roads, and landings. It makes it difficult to complete a well-done logging job on the lands I manage for my clients. So this is probably a forester answering. The loggers I hired to do the work are struggling more financially. The mills that purchase the wood are either starving or flooded, which are difficult conditions to operate in. And here's somebody from the procurement world. Extension of timber sale contracts to 2 years or more. AMP conformance is difficult. That's not what we want to hear, right? We want people to happily comply. Landowners finding logging disturbance to be extended past the usual time. So that usual time, let's face it, we thought we were going to be foresters and we just work in the woods, but really we need to manage landowner expectations and work with people. And their expectations may be based on what happened last time or the fact that maybe it's the first time in their generation that they've sold timber. Another thing I asked in that survey is about, what are your plans? What's the outlook for the future? So equal numbers told me they were downsizing and upsizing. So, and that's sort of to be expected. 30% said they were staying in the course. 12% said they need to find another way to make a living. So if that's a sawmill or a logger, that means a loss of capacity and probably a loss of markets. And then 30% they were diversifying products and services. If you're a logger, and I'm all for this. This is great. This is a good adaptation. But if loggers are diversifying services, it means they're doing less logging. And again, and they have to. Loss of, it's going to be a loss of capacity. I asked people to tell me, what adaptive practices are you following? And I gave them a long list and gave them plenty of room to write things in. And it's probably, came as I might expect, but increased use of stone for access, weather-conscious trucking, adaptive practices on the ground, innovation in AMP practices. So I love the stuff that Steve presented because it represents the innovation that has happened, right? Just brought together in one place and will continue to happen. But on the top of the list was this idea, and it played right into my hands because this is what I want to pursue. Emphasizing planning and project management. Close to 2/3 of the people said that. And I suspect the reason they did is because they know no one's coming to save them, right? If you want something you can do on your own, and probably at lower cost, that's great. If you wait for a policy to fix this, or the mills to realize they need to do this different, or something like that, well, good luck. I think you're going to see some well-intentioned efforts with some unintended consequences. Not to say some good things aren't going to happen, but I think people need to take it into their own hands. So how do they do that? Well, this is where I get to talk about critical chain project management, which I see as one of the things that's going to help us adapt, doing things differently. And as I said before, I was able to take these ideas and kind of figure out how do they work with forestry somewhat by talking with my Forest Business School group. And one of the things we talk about there is being willing to fail publicly in your own name. So I'm going to try something different next. Who brought their phone today? Okay, If you ever come to one of these things and say, I just need to send a text message real quick. Well, we're going to, hopefully, to prove a point, I hope you will play along with me and send a couple text messages, just so I can, as my entry into project management, talk about bad multitasking. So, would you, with your phone, you can text it to my number or text it to somebody in the other room. That's up to you, or text it home to someone who won't know what to think. But in 3 different lines in a single text message, type in SAF presentation, first line, and then the second line, critical chains, and the third line. Now feel free to say, hey, it's a great presentation, or you can just type long and boring. So when you type that all in, I'll watch and see if my phone blows up when this happens, see if anybody's playing along, and then hit enter. And I'll give you a minute. I was worried nobody was going to bring their phone. All right, how long did it take to do that? Barely started. We'll wait. We'll give you a minute. Wait till you see the part 2 of this then. Oh yeah, some of you sent it. Thank you. Okay, think about how long that took, and now let's try something different. Let's send the same message, except start with that first line and just type the first half of it. Just type SAF. And then you'll go down to the second line and type critical. And then the third line, long and then go back to the first line and do the second half. And go to the second line and type chains, and the last one, boring. Now, if you haven't figured this out, this is a great time to just text somebody else and act like you're playing along with this. This is a good full room. I hate it when there's just a few people and you have to respond, because my wife sends me important texts that I must respond to. But you don't want to do it when you're sitting in the front row. Okay, did anybody get that second text out yet? Yeah. How long did that take? Shorter. Shorter because you had my number in there already. Yeah, but you jumped around from one line to the next. It's supposed to take you longer, but I haven't done this before. But I read this in a book, and it worked that time, I'm telling you. So the first task was a single task, and this time we broke it up, and you got interrupted. And that gets at bad multitasking, and I'll talk more about that. But, and I want to distinguish between bad multitasking and multitasking, because how many of you are project managers? How many of you do projects in your work? Yeah. How many of you do more than once? More than one at once? And they start at different times and end at different times. So there's this continuous flow of projects, so there's ample opportunity for bad multitasking, right? Yeah. So I'm going to, before I talk about Goldrat's rules of flow, which is really what I want to talk about, I'll talk about these 5 diseases of project management. And I could spend an hour, but I'll probably keep it to about a minute. Bad multitasking is one of them. What's meant by that? Doesn't mean that you can't do more than one thing in a day or have more than one project going at once. But if you are making someone wait because you're distracted and working on another project, that's bad multitasking. If somebody on your team needs that piece before they can start on the next part of it, then that's the problem. Then you have student syndrome. Anybody know what that is? Where's Logan? You were a student not long ago. What's a student syndrome?
I couldn't tell you. I never had it.
Yeah. So it's waiting till the last minute, right? And we all know somebody that does that, I'm sure. First cousin to that is Parkinson's law. Anybody know what that one is? The work will expand to fill the time available. There's a cure for that, and I'll talk about it a little bit. Then task dependency. Task dependency, is a natural consequence of project management, but it's compounded when we have bad multitasking and student syndrome and so on. And then project management math. We might think one part of this takes 2 days and the other takes 2 days. It should equal 4. But do we transition well? Do we hand it off when someone needs it? So I was reminded of all these things the other day. A logger in northern Vermont texted me, and he said, I was ready to start my winter job in January to the point where I had a lowboy coming the next day to move my equipment, and that night the forester called me and said, the landowner doesn't know you're moving yet, and I don't have the contract ready. Oh, and by the way, I haven't marked the timber yet. Can you wait a week in January, right? So I think that forester's looking for another logger. I hope so. That's a great example of multi-aspects of bad project management on that person's behalf. So CCPM, critical chain project management, is sort of different than the way many of us do things. We often follow critical path modeling, and whether you know what that is or not, it's just kind of standard way people do business, and that often means each task has sort of an implicit buffer, like, okay, I've got this much time to finish this, so why don't I use it all up, okay? Critical chain project management means you identify the longest series of dependent events, and you put all your safety time at the end. You incentivize people to finish early by taking away their buffer. It's okay to be a little bit late, but you don't want to penalize them for being early. Now, those of us who are self-employed, I think, get this a little more intuitively, but when you work with an organization, sometimes we don't want people to realize how quickly we finish something, or there's disincentives for that, they'll give you more to do. We should incentivize finishing early so we can get on with our business. So there's a lot more to critical chain project management, but I'm going to just talk about Goldrat's rules of flow. So Eliyahu Goldrat was a physicist who was sort of a business pioneer. I'm guessing some of you probably read his great book, The Goal, and it's about production. Okay, so he also applied that theory, the theory of constraints, to project management, and I think he never quite got as far as he wanted in advancing it and getting it more in widespread use. So he's been dead for some time now, but his daughter, Elfrat Goldrat Ashlag, that's a mouthful, about 18 months ago came out with this book called Goldrat's Rules of Flow, and identified the rules of flow and explained it. And so I used this book with 2 Forest Business School groups this year, and then a couple of my alumni groups as well, and we talked about it. So I want to share with you each of these 8 rules of flow and how we figured out maybe to apply them. The first one, you've seen my example, avoid bad multitasking, control your work in progress. So we talked about, well, what does this really mean? How do we say it? And it's focus on the critical work items that others are waiting for, and only engage in work and other projects when no one is waiting for you to hand something off. You don't have to memorize all that. I made some real shortcuts. Just remember this. Multitask, hold others back. I've got 8 of these. Okay. Verify a full kit before starting to avoid getting stuck. So if you're a forester, apparently that means have lots of vacuum cleaners and things like that on your truck and really colorful vests. But to avoid delays, verify that all the necessary tools, supplies, resources, and people are lined up in place or readily available. If you're a logger, it probably means a service truck with common wear parts and all the tools you need, things like that. How many of you have started out to do a job and realized you didn't have what you need? Yeah, it's happened, right? And hopefully we learn from that. So, get ready, work steady. Triage to ensure you're working on the right priorities. So, as I mentioned, we want to identify that critical chain of dependent events and make sure we stay on it. So identify the critical chain of dependent events in the project and then review your work priorities as necessary to ensure the project flow. So sometimes you've got to step back and say, are we making progress here? If not, why not? So, step back and find the cracks. Ensure synchronization between tasks, people, and resources. This is just another way of saying manage well. The problem, I think, is most of us are really good forestry technicians, we like the work, and then it turns out we've got to work with teams and manage other people and actually be project managers. And that takes an additional set of talent. So managing project flow as opposed to working on the project means synchronization between steps, ensuring that your people have the things they need to get things done, provide everything they need to succeed. Manage flow and the work will go. Okay, now we come to my favorite one because I'll probably tell a story I shouldn't. So this has been the hardest one for people to grasp in the discussions I have. If repeatedly returning to the same projects without the desired result, consider increasing the dosage. What does that mean? Does that just mean work harder? It might, but it might mean doing something different. And I think we actually decided you could decrease the dosage in some cases. If you're a logger right now trying to make a living on 165 days a year instead of 200, you might want to be invested at a different level, right? And have a different set of equipment, a less expensive set of equipment, so on. So if they're not working, increase or decrease it. The allocation of resources, leverage, and including people, attention, intensity, equipment, and methods, and use a longer lever. Consistently, every group I spoke with had trouble grasping that, and I was struggling with how do I explain this? And about that time, this was back in January, and like a lot of you, I live in the sticks, and we have a nice bird feeder. My wife enjoys watching it, and there was this rodent that was coming, getting all the seeds, was kind of annoying. And so I dutifully, every day for about 2 weeks, would step out on the porch and take this running shot with a .22 and miss it because, I'm not as good as I think I used to be when I was 14 with that. And then one day, I wish I could say I looked at this and did it, but any Robert Earl Keen fans here? All right, so one day I stepped out on the porch with my single shot 410. Okay, the problem was solved, but I increased, and later I thought, I increased the dosage. And the next time that problem came up, I didn't use the .22. Okay, all come pour, alter the core. I promise you, a couple of these are good. A couple of the catchphrases will get better. Okay, avoid unnecessary rework by identifying its causes. Anybody ever find themselves doing the same thing over and over again? Yeah, with the same results. So repeatedly doing things over can be avoided by identifying and fixing the cause. Seek and tweak. And what I think of as the first cousin to this is recommend standardization when improvisation is costly. Systems are better than goals. Be prepared with tools, methods, and supplies for problems that are difficult to solve without them. Systems are faster than ad hoc solutions. So we all had that time where we saved the day by fixing something, right, or rigging something together. 4 or 5 years ago, I was close to the top of a mountain with 2 plots to go, and the end of my diameter tape broke off. And I had in my pack a finished nail, a hatchet, and a zip tie. And we fixed it, and I didn't have to climb the mountain again. A better system would have been to have 2 diameter tapes, right? And so that's what I did from then on. All right, stacks, not hacks. And this one, focus on the global optimum rather than the local optimum. And I should have said, these are not sequential items. These are just a good set of rules that may apply in different situations. This can be hard because we sometimes don't communicate what the global optimum is to people. Action should serve the project goal, not individual steps or personal goals. We're often concerned with our part of a project and doing that well, but we don't know what the overall goal is. So good project management will communicate that. Goals before roles. If you've got a better one for that, I'll gladly take it. So this is a culture shift in project management. It means adopting thorough planning and preparation, alignment of tasks, completion with project objectives. It's easy to say these things, it's easy to learn these things. Implementation involves getting people to do things differently. Do people like to do things differently? Not so much, so we've got our work cut out. So what problems does critical chain project management solve? Well, some of the ones that were articulated earlier here. Not enough revenue to cover your overhead. Well, if you finish a project sooner and the amount of revenue is fixed, you have the opportunity to go on and earn more revenue on other projects. or to fill the mill in short amounts of time, or to get a logger to come and do your prescription because you have everything ready when they're ready, and you're in sync on those things. So the benefits of projects finishing on time or early, there's compounding positive impacts. If you're ahead of the game, you'll stay there. Anybody ever get behind and you feel like you can't dig your way out of the hole? Well, the opposite is true. You can be ahead of the game and be ready and be on top of things and get farther ahead. Supply chain participants will complete their objectives, whether it's accomplishing forestry, producing wood, making a living, supplying their mill, on time. That'll be better, and we'll have more adaptation. All right, so I'll give the last word on this critical chain project management to Elfret, Goat-Red, Ashlag. There's no sense in talking about the solution before we agree on the problem, and no sense talking about the implementation steps before we agree on the solution. So I guess I'm not talking about the bigger problems posed by climate change. I'm interested in the symptomatic problems experienced in the supply chain and the problems that individual players are having. So to that end, I'll be focusing on getting a good short course out on critical chain project management and other related materials, along with some other things that'll come out of that needs assessment. So in summary, climate challenges are compounding problems in the forest product supply chain at a critical time. We're losing capacity in the supply chain, and the weak link, I think, is the logging. People in the forest product supply chain are adapting to challenges. We're seeing that. We just might not be seeing enough of it, and CCPM can help in doing that. So, all right. So I think we have time for questions. All right. Let's see if we get any here.
We do have time for some questions. Everybody seems ready for the icebreaker.
We're between them and the beer, I think. Graham.
What happens if we get another 12 to 18 months of the weather that we've had over the last 12 months? That's 50% of the loggers in, let's say, Vermont go out with a lot of this. Do you think that's a real...
I think that's a real, I don't know about 50%, but that's a real threat. I don't think we have any good numbers on the number of people that have dropped out. Remember, this isn't happening in a vacuum. This is happening as people are getting close to retirement age anyway, right? Vermont has more young loggers than I see in New York, but not enough.
My question was, how do you see moving on in the future? Is this can be viewed as very disparaging for the up and coming generations, whether they're in the procurement, something forestry side, or getting into logging. How do you see the improvement of the young and up and coming going? Because I know I just graduated college. There's quite a few of us that are either not
despite the doom and gloom, I wish I graduated into this job market, because I sure didn't. There are opportunities there because people aren't getting into it. For young loggers going into it, though, it's an uphill challenge. They've got to not just be, you can't just be good at cutting the wood, you've got to be a good business person. And so that's equally important to, the skills that you're going to learn out in the woods.
I guess building on improvising stuff, are you seeing more loggers try to mobilize on salvage cuts and operations where you got to act quickly to get the wood while you can, like blow down occurs?
If the opportunity is there, I'm seeing it. What I'm seeing is that the marginal jobs aren't going to get done because there's not enough logging capacity. Remember that they don't operate in a vacuum. They can't say, oh, there's some blowdown I've got to cut. There's somebody else that's got to facilitate that, whether it's the landowner or there's a forester involved.
Great. I just really want to thank both our speakers for some really spot-on practical news.
So just a couple of quick announcements before you head off to the beer. The social hour is going to be downstairs in the exhibition.
Hey, this is Steve Bick with the Forest Business School. Thanks for listening to the FBS podcast, and I hope you will subscribe. The truth is, these deep dives barely scratch the surface of some of the topics we cover in the Forest Business School programs, and the podcast is a way of reaching a wider audience. Check out my website at vtfbs.com for more information. Reach out if you want to talk about one of the FBS programs or have custom training or project needs that you'd like to discuss. Again, thanks for listening to the FBS podcast.